Mr. Speaker.
I call the honourable member Chris Ockenvold.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I too would like to express support for this particular bill, but also to comment on the progress of the Select Committee that handled this particular bill. It was a pleasure to be part of that, but I think the chair of the committee, Honourable Ruth Dyson, who's just spoken, is being a little coy and a little modest over her part in the whole process. It was inspired chairmanship, and indeed I would concur with her remarks that there was full involvement on the part of all members of the committee. I always enjoyed committee work, but particularly where you get a mix of youth and vigour and experience and wisdom and a fair amount of opinion. And Trevor Mallard provided considerable guidance, I suppose, in the way these processes can emerge and be corrected. And Gareth Hughes, indeed, pursued the point of regulations not impacting on private privilege and that sort of thing. I think one of the most interesting parts of all was the response of the officials who took our work very seriously, who provided information very thoroughly. And the only disagreement really I have with the Honourable Ruth Dyson was to suggest that we should have had less to do. The whole purpose of a committee, to my mind, is to shape a bill, to give it flavour, to get it right, and we certainly had that opportunity. But from the very beginning, and it has had quite an extended life to get it to where it is at the moment, it's been well thought of. I just was reading the regularity impact statement, which is quite an interesting piece of work, and it says the enactment of this legislation will preserve the ongoing integrity of the service and will maximise the efficiencies that are expected from its full implementation and use, both for the government and for the public. I think that's one of the principal parts of this particular bill. It's not for the government in isolation, it is for the public to use in conjunction with government services. And the regulatory impact statement continues and says, this is a classic instance of regulation providing certainty for the provision and operation of a government service, therefore maximising the benefits that are expected to result both for the public and for the government. So it's a really good match. It's a really good match. I know one of the things that particularly appealed to me was that much of our lives, from a regulatory point of view, are paper-driven. And so as a rural JP as well as an MP, I'm familiar with phone calls, people who have to get documents ready, be it for passport applications, immigration purposes, or any of the myriad of things that where we connect with government. And so very often, and particularly in the case of immigration, I know we're working on that as part of the improving public service system, but it is a paper-driven policy arrangement. And so you have a need to verify documents. And so people in a rural situation, and when I'm talking about a rural situation, I'm often meaning, it can be people who live, say, at Otira and have a long way to come before they can get to Greymouth or a centre of government. And so they have to come and have documents copied, and this can put them to considerable expense and considerable time constraints. And so it's quite good to have a system where we'll be able to have an identity verification system through electronic means. One of the features that we did take particular note of at the Select Committee is we introduced higher penalties for organisations that commit offences under the bill in order to create a sufficient deterrent and appropriate punishment. And I would commend those changes to Parliament because I've been in a situation where my own identity information as a corporate person, a company, has been sold by the agency which held that information. They just sold their whole file to people who were peddling shares. And I used to get calls from New York, very persistent people, And they would say, you are one of the biggest dealers in New Zealand. So I said, honestly, you got the wrong guy. And there had been confusion in their records. The records that they sold weren't even correct, but it resulted in a huge invasion of privacy. So when we looked at the costs associated with abusing that information or selling it, it really wasn't going to be a very expensive exercise. The penalties weren't very severe. And so we got advice on that, and we've certainly lifted the penalties so that people would have to think several times before they engaged. And so that, I think, has closed off, and certainly it'll make it a very expensive exercise if people do try and commit offences. In addition, the regulation-making power to specify the duration for which the Department of Internal Affairs can retain personal information if an individual no longer uses the service was another recommendation that we put forward. If people have ceased to use that service, we don't want the information at risk. By the same token, you don't want to get rid of it too quickly, otherwise it can be subject to, or fraud could continue and you haven't got the records to check it back. So we've made tighter controls as a suggestion on that. There's an amount of other information which I'm sure other members of the committee will bring to the attention of Parliament, Mr. Speaker, but it was a very pleasantly non-partisan, non-political bill with a lot of involvement on the part of all members of the committee. It's a ripper of a little bill, a good one, and it'll be useful. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
I call the honourable member Clear Curran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.